Michelle Merlizo and I will talk about issues. I'm not sure it'll be really a debate because I think we agree on what most of the issues and outlook are. But we'll talk about Airbus, the future, and where we're going. So if that's set, a couple of rules. One is we will have question and answers available to the audience later. What we'd like you to do is submit those questions via chat. There's a chat button at the lower part of your screen. And if you submit those via chat, you can do that anytime during the webinar. And and not lose your question if you have one in mind. So please feel free to chat throughout the webinar and submit questions. We're happy to address those. And with that, I'll give it to Addison to do the introductions and move us forward.
Thank you, Ernie. Just to let everybody know, we are recording. If you are not comfortable with the recording, please feel free to get off the call. No one will be offended. So today we're going to have some opinion and perspectives on Airbus. We're going to be talking about how this will impact the supply chain, obviously the airlines and the industry. And as Ernie mentioned, we will be allowing you to post questions to the panel. And the idea here is we want to promote discussion. It's not to be critical or not to be judgmental, but it's a matter of trying to come up with a amount of learning. What can we gather from all this? So the panelists, for those of you who've come regularly, you're probably familiar with Ernie Arvai, the president of AirInsight Group. He's got decades of experience in commercial aviation. And our next speaker is Michelle Merlizo, also decades of experience in the industry. And Michelle and Ernie were the two panelists that started our series on the OEMs. We did one on Boeing, and now we're doing this one on Airbus. So if we could proceed to the next slide, just to let you know that whatever Michelle shares, there is a disclaimer, and the contents provided in the presentation by Michelle are not for attribution, and it's not cleared for use by anybody in the media without written permission from AIR, which is Michelle's organization. So the first presentation in the conversation here will be from Michelle.
Thank you, Addison. Well, this morning, I think we are extending our debate or similarly to what we did 3 weeks ago, I believe, I just want to, give a situation analysis concerning Airbus and basically give you our projected figures for AIR and where we think Airbus stands now and where we think they're heading, and also look at their production output, market shares, and discuss some other elements associated with the performance and the outlook for the company. So Airbus, over the next 15 plus years, we believe that they're still going to look at over 13,000 new production aircraft, and you see the production list price at 1.5 trillion. That's of course a price point that needs to be halved in the best cases, in our opinion. The decline for 2020 will be substantial in the area of 41%, but we see a gradual resumption of production, and I say very gradual, very progressive, very careful, at around 6 to 8% year over year, culminating with a recovery to 2019 production volumes in 2025. What is interesting is you see that the mix between narrow body in light gray and wide body in darker is completely different from 2019. This is in fact due to the changes in fleet mix with operators and the penalties associated with the the wide body market share gains that Airbus had made over the past, I would say, 5 to 10 years. If you look at the production outputs and the pie charts below, you see that, of course, it is a very heavily dominated narrow body production output on the left side for commercial, for Airbus commercial. If we factor in the replacement of the 320 Neo family, which should kick in sometime around 32, 33, that percentage is around 85% narrow body production output for Airbus. You see a significant compression of the wide body deliveries. Nevertheless, we should see some resumption of preference for wide bodies in the back end period of the forecast. For Airbus Defense Security, see quite a nice mix between special mission assets, combat aircraft, and tanker transport aircraft as well. We're reasonably optimistic that Airbus is going to be able to gain some additional footholds in the North American market. Will it be with the C-400 or will it be with other tanker options? That needs to be, I think, further analyzed. But I think if we look honestly at the level of exposure of Airbus on US markets, it still is a very steep hill to climb for Airbus military in North America. We are expecting a very, I would say, decisive block move on the part of the Boeing company to prevent Airbus from gaining additional market footprint with the US Department of Defense. So looking at our key concern, before I get there, I want to talk a little bit about the chart above those points. You see that the decline of Boeing is far sharper than Airbus. You see that Airbus recovers moderately, Boeing recovers, and the two production volumes sort of merge between 22, 24. And I think that illustrates the problematic that the Boeing company currently has with respect to its product portfolio and its very, I would say, inferior product development strategy when it comes to its narrow body and middle of market solutions. I think Airbus has a lot more traction deep into the 2020s and 2030s with the 320 family and derivatives. And we see that both companies regain sufficient traction in the 2030s with new narrow body solutions. So our key concern to conclude this part of the presentation, the key concern are geopolitical and the continuing level and increasing level of exposure of the enterprise to trade and tariff sanctions from the US in particular. Airbus will be particularly vulnerable to what I call the divide and conquer US foreign policy vis-a-vis Europe, meaning the absence of a strong Brussels, the absence of a unified European policy is, I think, one of Airbus's greatest problem to solve over the next 5 years. Regardless of who sits in the White House, whether it's President Trump or Vice President Biden, it is clear that the US approach to dividing the European Union with either the aircraft carrier called the UK or other options will be all on the table in the next 5 to 7 years. Opportunities, I think further international diversification is definitely on the card for Airbus, especially when it comes to M&A choices. We've seen the efforts by the French government and European Union for the further integration of advanced carbon neutral technologies in next narrow body technologies. I think Europe is slightly ahead of the United States in that regard, but let's not underestimate the United States' ability to respond from a technological standpoint fairly rapidly. In conclusion, and I think this will be also Ernie's points, we view the Airbus portfolio as particularly adapted for the next 5 to 7 years with the 220 and the 321 family in particular, and that will strengthen the Airbus market position against its main competitor. But let's not also underestimate Boeing, who remains very strong when it comes to cargo solutions, whether it's BCF or new build cargo. Airbus has a steep hill to climb in that regard, and the absence of a strong solution is a key concern as far as AIR is concerned. Ernie, up to you.
Thank you, Michel. I would like to talk briefly about Airbus market position. We believe Airbus has now captured market leadership from Boeing in the near term. There's a massive lead in firm orders for narrow-body aircraft, and that lead with the cancellations from Norwegian to Boeing yesterday is now 6770 as of June 1st for Airbus to looks like 3664 now for Boeing after the 92 cancellations yesterday. And the wide body gap is not that great either. While Boeing leads in the wide body market, if we take away the freighters in the wide body market, we're pretty close between the two companies in terms of the order backlog. The A350 has sold pretty well since its introduction compared to the 787. And the question is, will the 777X grab some traction and allow Boeing to grow? And in the current market with COVID-19, we think that would be deferred for some time. So we're not projecting a strong rebound in the wide body market in the near term. Airbus offers a new technology solution in the A220 that should be an airplane that's primed for the recovery. If we're looking at recovery from smaller narrow-body aircraft as the lowest risk for airlines to reintroduce routes, the 220 is well positioned. The question is, can Airbus build them fast enough and capture orders for them from airlines who really can't afford much in today's environment? So some creativity may be needed. Airbus is also well positioned for growth. There are now assembly operations in 5 countries on 3 continents. So Airbus is well positioned to be a more domestic player in several markets and avoid tariffs. In terms of the outlook for Airbus, we think the product line is pretty well positioned in the near term. The A220 is a class leader. It's a superb airplane that has great range and good capabilities, class-leading economics. The A321 has become the most popular narrow-body offering from Airbus. It's the majority of the orders for Airbus narrow bodies this year. It's outselling the A320neo, and it is effectively the 757 replacement. And Airbus has taken that market away from Boeing. The A350 has performed well, and since it came into service, it's outsold the 787, although the 787 had a massive lead beforehand. Airbus will need a next generation narrow body to compete with Boeing's future small aircraft in the 2030s time frame. Probably 2032, 2033, we see Boeing as probably having to replace the MAX before Airbus has to replace the 320neo. Management team needs to focus on taking advantage of the market leadership position, and that means reducing costs and improving margins, as Airbus has trailed Boeing typically over the last few years in productive and profitability and margins. So reducing cost, taking a hard look at the supply chain, including a very hard look at the A220 supply chain, as that airplane needs to come down in price. Improving productivity and leveraging automation will be 3 major goals there. And I think leveraging the multinational presence to negate some of the high costs that are incurred in France will also be important to Airbus over the next few years. Global supplier competition is important, and I think having a wider global supply chain with multiple sources will be a trend we'll see from Airbus, and also some firmer demands on the supply chain. Airbus wasn't as hard on its suppliers as Boeing was in partnering for success, and if they want to get equivalent margins to Boeing, they've got to be that much firmer. So that's our introduction, and And Addison, we'll turn it over to you to moderate.
Okay, if you could take me to the Q&A slide, we'll start there. Gentlemen, Airbus is currently ahead, and that's obviously because of the MAX debacle. But if you look at market traction in the narrow bodies, and narrow bodies is clearly the most important part of this market to look at, can Boeing catch up? I don't know who would like to go first.
It's of course, I think, presumptuous to say Boeing can catch up. And as a company with extraordinary resources and talent base and capabilities. One thing that the Boeing company has that Airbus doesn't necessarily have is the backing of the US government and a defense market that will always be there, as far as we can tell, in order to support the company. So in that regard, I don't have any concern about the Boeing company at large. What I have concerns about is the poor product strategy decisions that were made under the leadership of Jim Albo and his strategy group to launch the 737 MAX. In hindsight, I think we're all geniuses, we agree to that, but MAX was a poor decision, let's put it this way. And I think the strategic initiative and the foresight that Airbus had at the time in launching the 320neo really put Boeing in a corner. That leads me to think about the current Airbus governance, and I mentioned that briefly in my slide in writing, but the governance at the time at Airbus is not the same as what we have today. We have, Christian Scherer, we have a few people that, where are the core of the decision or involved in the decision on the 320neo. My concern about Airbus is about the governance and the relative lack of experience from what you had with the team led by Tom Andrews, Tom Williams, and Fabrice Berger, who were working extremely well together. But going back to Boeing, no, the MAX cannot catch up to the 320 family, pure and simple. And I think Bernie said very, very clearly that is going to force some decisions on product strategy on the part of Boeing, whether they go after the middle of the market with a revised NMA in order to counter the 321 and the 330 further, or they decide to jump the gun and go for quote unquote the heart of the narrow body market. That is remains to be seen, but they will be undeniably so launching first if they need to.
I agree with Michelle, and Boeing does have the capability to catch up, but not with their existing product line. They need FSA and NMA to be winners to counter A220, A320neo, and A321. And that's going to be problematic to them until they can do a new airplane. And that will be some time before the new engine technology comes out that will enable the kind of step function gap in economics that you need to launch a new product. So we think Boeing is stuck in second place until the 2030s.
And this is a risk as well, I would say. There is, Boeing is able to do a new narrow body aircraft by the 2030s, unquestionably so. But are the new technologies that are still at lower TRL levels, are the new production systems and tooling required to, get to the rates that narrow body aircraft production will require in the 2030? Will these be ready? Will these be mature sufficiently for Airbus, for Boeing to launch the aircraft before Airbus? And again, Airbus has got better traction with its current product line, and they will be, if they launch deeper into the 2030s, they will be able to technologically inject several elements that may not be as accessible to Boeing. The question is fundamentally, who goes first and how quickly the other one follows.
The other question is how radical the design needs to change for our times. If we look at the cross section of the 767 or 737 MAX, it dates back to the 707. So we've seen something that's been out there for 60 years in terms of the basic fundamental cross section and design of the airplane. Is it time for a blended wing? Is it time for an all new technology look? Do we see an airplane that's radically different coming in the 2030s? And that's the real question, something that could potentially be adapted to a future hybrid. There's a new platform that's needed, and the question is who's going to be the one to innovate, whether that will be Boeing or Airbus. And that's really what we're looking at, is a degree of innovation for the next generation that will take us for the next 50 or 60 years.
So it's interesting that you guys, I haven't mentioned the word leapfrog, but that's clearly where this goes in terms of product scenario and the product leapfrog that's needed. So Ernie, you mentioned that Boeing needs to start having its MAX replacement ready before 2030, right? So if that's the
yes,
case,
or around 2030, I don't think there's that much. Well, the MAX will not have the legs or the window of opportunity for new sales. We don't see much of an opportunity over the next couple of years to generate MAX orders, as we're in a downturn, and there are essentially 800 airplanes being redelivered or delivered that have already been built. So the opportunity to generate new sales over the next couple of years through 2024, let's say, is rather limited. Then we've got a period of 2024 through 2027 or so where where there's the ability to sell some more airplanes. But after that, people are going to be looking for that new technology, either from Airbus or Boeing. And if that new technology is coming in 2030, 2031, 2032, we're going to know about those designs a little bit in advance, and people will anticipate that. And will the orders be there for the older airplanes without a dramatic drop in price or margin? So that gives a short window of time to capitalize on the MAX. And we think there's only a couple of years of 2 to 3 to 4 years of potential strong sales left for that model at this point. Airbus can exploit that with the 320neo. They could also exploit that with new models, perhaps an A220-500 and an A220-700 to go after it from a different direction, from the lower end up. And a stretch of the A220 would be a very efficient new technology airplane that would compete very effectively.
So do you think that the 220 and derivatives thereof, and the 320neo family, which I guess focuses particularly on the 321, how long can those airplanes hold off a new FSA?
Well, let's be Addison, Ernie, before we get into this linear thinking in a normal, what we call Care Bear world, this is not going to happen. Economic warfare is coming between the European Union and the US, and this is going to have a profound impact on purchase decisions and on the competitiveness of Airbus products in North America. So before we say, can the 320, can the 737 MAX hold on for a few more years, we have to look at the scenario under which Airbus is severely affected by trade tariffs and extraterritorial behavior on the part of the US outside of the North American market. It will affect, to a degree, the competitiveness of Airbus in several key markets. Factored into this, we're going to have the rise of COMAC. I know it's going to be very progressive, very slow into the 2030s. But, we need to introduce that political, that trade, what I call warfare variable into the equation, because it will have a profound impact on the way MAX is going to continue to sail deep into the 2030s to an extent. And let's not think that Boeing is going to sit and do nothing about the MAX. They're going to evolve the product in order to make it more relevant to their existing customers. Yes, I agree with Ernie. The 320, 321 is a superior product in several key aspects. But there are many ways that Boeing is going to be able to influence and shape customer requirements.
Okay, so let's focus then on Airbus. What about the future of Airbus in the UK? How does that look?
Not good.
You have that center of excellence for the wing design. What's going to happen? Where's that IP going to come from for Airbus then, if they don't focus on bringing that with them somehow.
And again, you know, let's think not just in terms of competencies, but let's think in terms of trade policies and the future of the European Union, and the fact that you know, there are other programs such as FCAS and other unmanned solutions currently being discussed. It's all a game of trading within the European Union and trading outside the European Union. The UK has made a choice to leave the European Union, and there will be, unfortunately for the country, consequences as far as the Airbus footprint in the country. You know, Spain is the de facto natural destination for a lot of the aerostructures work for Airbus, as is Germany to a degree, and France, of course. So the future of the UK aerospace industry is going to be, whether we like it or not, affected by the Brexit decision. And we know the Spaniards have very strong competencies in several key composite technology major aerostructural works. And for me, it's the natural destination for any potential wing work in particular, or horizontal tail, horizontal surfaces work in that country, in that regard, for the next Airbus product.
It's interesting that
the other side of that coin is Rolls-Royce, which has a special relationship with Airbus, and doesn't look like it's going to move to the continent anytime soon. So we think the engines will probably still have to come from the UK, and some trade negotiation will have to happen between the EU and the UK, or Airbus has to go with GE engines, who also have a special relationship with Boeing. So that could be problematic down the road as well.
Okay, so one of the things that you both mentioned at the beginning was the fact that Airbus has several FALs around the world. So what are the geopolitical risks for Airbus in terms of having this? They essentially de-risk their business by having these FALs around the place. But if there's, as Michelle points out, you know, there is a real thing with this, the trade, I don't want to use the word war, but let's say the trade aggression between nations.
Trade aggression.
I'm trying to be polite.
It's trade warfare. Let's call it what it is. Listen, you know, Airbus has there are benefits to having all those files around the world. There are also key benefits from having one concentrated location in Renton for Boeing. It's all about what your perception of risk and your legacy systems are all about. You know, Airbus, you know, I've been fortunate to go to Tianjin, I've been fortunate to go to Mobile and see how this location operates. And they do, you know, operate fairly seamlessly and fairly well in terms of their abilities to produce required rates. China, I think, is a market that Airbus is going to continue benefiting tremendously from, and the Chinese are, of course, going to continue leveraging their relationship with Airbus to their advantages from a standpoint of work packages, from a standpoint of you know, personnel training, other things. It will last as long as COMAC is not a strong enough, you know, participants to supply the Chinese industry with narrow body and wide body aircraft. When will that be? I think by the mid-2030s we should get there, but the demand for the Chinese market is going to remain very strong, and we're going to be in a duopolistic situation for China, except that by the 2030s, Boeing will be replaced by COMAC. It will be COMAC Airbus, basically supplying products to the Chinese market. Now, as far as the United States is concerned, you know, this was a very, I would say, impressive move on the part of the leadership of Airbus Americas and Airbus in Toulouse to really move forward with the Mobile final assembly line, even though the tanker contract had been awarded to Boeing, you know, in circumstances that we will not comment upon here. But what I think is particularly connected to the future of the FAL, the FAL and Mobile is the future of the relationship between Airbus and Lockheed Martin. There is still a little bit of uncertainty as to which direction Lockheed Martin is looking for with Airbus. I think it's got a lot to do with the political environment. It's got a lot to do with, again, trade warfare and what's next. But if there is a ray of hope, I think, for Airbus in North America, it's got to come from Lockheed Martin and potential partnership that could be very fruitful over the next 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, I think the two sides of the coin for Airbus is that having multiple assembly lines eliminates some political risk and some trade risk for them around the world, but it also is not as efficient as having one line that is superbly executed as Boeing has in Renton. They build airplanes rapidly, they build them well, they build them cost effectively. So there's a trade-off between cost and political risk. And in the situation with China, the political risk may outweigh the cost because it looks like that's a market that COMAC and Airbus will dominate for the foreseeable future.
Right. I would agree with you, your comments about Renton, but of course, Renton is one earthquake away from not being so effective. Okay, so what are your concerns about Airbus governance? You know, you've got a new group of people running the company now. They seem to be very good. Any comments on that?
The question is the experience level in terms of the executive team and in moving forward. I think we've got a good group of people there. It's a matter of choosing the right strategies moving forward, and we're coming into a time where they're going to have to be making some strategic decisions in terms of what their new product portfolio is going to look like, and what Airbus is going to look like for the 2030s and beyond. Generally, programs in this industry have to start about 10 to 12 years before they enter service. So if we're looking at a 2030 timeframe, we're probably looking at products that people are thinking about right now. And the question is, how will those decisions come down, and will they make the right decisions? And the jury is out. We don't know this team that doesn't have a track record as yet, as the old team did. So we'll find out the hard way.
Well, Guillaume Faury is probably one of the best leader that Airbus has ever had. He's a very quick, very decisive. So as far as Guillaume is concerned, I have no concern about his ability to lead Airbus out of this situation. Christian Scherer, I've talked about Christian. Again, a superbly able person. He's done the rounds in the company. He knows it inside out. And they have, of course, a great CTO is Gracia Capitani. I mean, she's a very forward-thinking person, and so to that regard, I'm a little bit cautious because yes, you've had a turnaround in the governance that is significant over the past with us, DJ Everard, Tom Williams, and all those guys, but again, you'll have a progressive remediation to that situation. So governance is a minor concern, but it's a concern nevertheless.
Okay, I'm going to move to some of the Q&A now from the audience. And the next question is very apropos given the news yesterday from Norwegian. What do you see for cancellations on Airbus single-aisle aircraft?
I see more deferrals than cancellations on single-aisle aircraft. I think there will be some carriers who probably will go belly up in the current turmoil if they're not bailed out by their governments. But from a cancellation standpoint, most of the carriers who can survive, I think, will negotiate deferrals of deliveries. So I don't see more than 10% in terms of cancellations overall.
Yeah, I agree with Ernie. I mean, there's some airlines out there that are very leveraged, but also well managed, like Indigo. some carriers in Asia. Of course, Airbus is very loaded, heavy loaded in Asia with Asian carriers on the narrow body side. So there's a little bit of concern there. But as was Ernie on this one, I see more deferrals than cancellations because, again, the product has a lot more traction.
Right, that makes sense. Question, where do you see the threat and opportunities for the Chinese domestic market and domestic manufacturers? Which we kind of spoke about briefly before, but if you want to address that directly.
Well, we'll talk about COMAC in a future webinar in a few weeks. But again, we're not there yet with respect to COMAC being able to compete for another 10 years. It's going to be some time before the supply chain transition to domestic sole source, so that there absolutely no dependency whatsoever on US and to a degree European manufacturers, because the European supply chain will come under pressure, increased pressure from the United States extraterritoriality, interference on the export of key parts and key technical solutions to the Chinese industry. So, the Chinese rise, we're not going to get into the complexities associated with the current CCP issues and the pools between G and the reformers. That's a completely different issue. But the Chinese rise is going to be slowed down by US and European interference to some degree. One element we haven't mentioned yet is the health of the Airbus supply chain, and I think Ernie can jump on this issue as well. The supply chain at Airbus is my key point of concern, particularly when it comes to aerostructures. It's a very fragmented supply chain, especially with aerostructures. So I would expect the next year or so to be particularly intense with respect to consolidation between tier one actors in that segment, and rescue packages or rescue acquisition targeted at tier two participants, particularly those who are severely affected by the MAX crisis and the Spirit issues. I'm thinking in particular about Figeac, who is a key concern to me, and Aubert Duval, who might be a nice acquisition target as well, and who is a key supplier to Airbus.
I agree with Michel that I think we'll see some consolidation in the supply chain in the coming years, and perhaps a couple of key strategic acquisitions from Airbus in that regard. It is a point that with the expansion of the A220 in Montreal, there's a supply chain there that is looking for additional business, ready to sharpen its pencils to maintain business and compete. So I think there are opportunities for folks to consolidate and to secure multi-location capabilities within the Airbus supply chain, and that could be an interesting twist.
And I think if you're looking at renegotiating contract, if you're Airbus and Boeing, as a matter of fact, if you're looking at renegotiating contract and switching supplier in order to control cost and remedy to issues you've been dealing with because of contractual obligation for the past decade or so, now is the time to do it. So I think for both Airbus and Boeing, we're going to see, work packages shifting potentially over from one supplier to the other in the next couple of years. That's definitely a possibility.
If there ever was a time to consolidate and work on changing this supply chain and optimizing it, this is the time, and that potentially includes sourcing from places like China, as well as we look toward the future and building some parts there for Airbus. So it's not necessarily restricted to the EU and North America.
We've been dwelling quite a bit on narrow bodies, and here's an interesting question. Is there any possibility for an A380 secondary market with a large amount of retirements due to COVID? Is there a second life for the 380?
Yes, there is. And it's not wishful thinking. And you know me and my opinion about the 380. The 380 Neo was killed by political interference. But let's say that it makes for potentially an interesting cargo aircraft with limitations, of course, because the design is what it is. It makes potentially for an interesting combi aircraft as well. Will the 380 have a second life? Yes. Will it be significant? Probably not. It will be all about optimizing, the aircraft to the operating model, whether it's combi or whether it's just purely cargo.
There are certain markets in which an A380 works. There are a few of those, unfortunately, but the cargo market is one that it should work well if the cargo conversions work well. And a combi version where you've got passenger and freight could be economical if done the right way. So the question is, how much will it cost? And is that still cost effective? And how low will the feedstock prices be for those conversions?
I think the feedstock prices will be pretty strong, right?
Strong as in weak or strong as in overpriced?
Strong as in affordable.
Okay. All right. Next question around automation. Airbus seems to be ahead of Boeing. It presented some interesting developments at last year's Innovation Days. Around the same time, Boeing said it would reduce the use of robots on the 777X line. Is Airbus really ahead?
Yes, probably. Listen, I mean, that's the 777X line. There was significant risk with the approach that Boeing selected on a 777X, and obviously it materialized. But you know what? You got to try. You got to try. And Airbus, yes, Airbus has been introducing automation a little bit ahead of Boeing. They've gained significant experience. They've got, it's not so much an Airbus strength as it is a key supplier strength. I mean, in particular, when you look at Stelia, when you look at Daher or Premium Aerotech, those are companies that have been pioneered of automation in their own rights. Of course, they're derived from the Airbus family. Let's not forget that. But get strong, robotic, strong automotive. Again, we go back to the intertwining interconnections between different industries. The automotive industry in Germany has been particularly innovative when it comes to automation over the past 30 years, and that innovation, migrates into other industries as well. The automotive industry in the United States. Well, Ernie, you can talk a little bit about that if you want. I'm sure you don't have entirely positive things to say, but it is clear that Airbus has worked on the automation of composite production a little bit differently than Boeing. And if you're asking me, whether Airbus is ahead for what we think the technology and the production system methods for next generation of aircraft is going to be like, yes, they are. I think the choices with respect to automation on the 787 only partially address what the requirement for the next generation aircraft is going to be like. And you can certainly not achieve the same production rates using the 787 production automation that you would for a narrow-body aircraft.
I would agree with Michel that Airbus has a slight lead there, and the system that was attempted on the 777X actually Airbus made work in Hamburg for the A321 line, and not without some slowdowns and not without some difficulties and some pain along the way, but they got it to work. And I think they're a little bit ahead of the game in terms of understanding that experience and understanding the failure points. We tend to learn more from failure than we do from success. And having had a tough time in getting that automation in place, Airbus has learned a lot of lessons that I think are very valuable as it moves toward the future.
Our next question comes up on a subject we briefly touched on, which around engines. Where do you see the future alignment with engine manufacturers? Do you see the transatlantic divide becoming even more embedded?
I see the transatlantic divide as becoming more embedded in the wide body category, but I see the Pratt & Whitney GTF as a viable option on the A320 family that has gained a fair amount of market share, and It's certainly the most efficient power plant in its class. Now that the teething pains are gone, it may capture additional share.
Again, we don't know how the United States, Europe, and China are going to come out of this crisis and the one that's coming up. But you know, for Europe, it is going to be a matter of long-term strategic independence and decisions associated with independence. Transatlantic partnerships is critically vital to the industry and the stability of this world. But Europe has perhaps starting to look toward China for targeted specific engine partnership. We've seen this in some unmanned military systems. And the question is, will the Chinese migrate some of their requirements for market access to engine technologies in the next 5 to 10 years? The CR929 is very likely to be powered by a Rolls-Royce engine. They're about 12 years from having a reasonably performing engines entering service on the 919 NG. The question for Europe is, how much dependency do you want to keep with US technology, and how much strategic interest is there to connecting with the Chinese on engine technologies?
And also, is there intellectual property to protect in the case? And are there risks that you take long term in dealing with the Chinese in that regard? And that's a question that that would take a long time to answer.
I mean, let's put it this way: there is intellectual property risk on both sides of the fence, but we know that there are legal issues that are certainly not as significant on the US side.
Right.
Okay, next question. Comment on the relative exposure in backlog for Airbus and Boeing with respect to leasing companies and LCCs. Of course, we saw what happened with Norwegian yesterday, and of course, Lion Air is another one that a lot of people have been watching and waiting for. Any thoughts?
I think the Lion Air exposure is on both sides, as they've got both Boeing and Airbus exposure, and Norwegian is certainly one that was impacted, but they canceled their Airbus orders well before the Boeing orders, so it can go in both directions, and it's hard to predict. In terms of the leasing companies, I think the leasing companies have been cutting back on 737 orders. They've stayed strong, or perhaps moved more to A321s from A320 orders, given the popularity of that airplane and its flexibility to be used on potentially international routes, replacing some of the smaller wide bodies as traffic rebuilds. So I think the flexibility of the A321 is a factor that will keep the narrow body orders with leasing companies alive a bit longer.
Okay. Next question. A clean sheet aircraft would cost $15 billion. Who can afford it in the next years?
We're not talking about a clean sheet aircraft being launched in the next 3 to 5 years. We're talking about a launch that takes us beyond the 2025 mark, okay? So definitely, I think Boeing is financial position is a little concerned, but again, as I said, you know, the Boeing company is a more diversified, stronger organization than Airbus. Let's face it. What I think happens is 15 billion. Yes, it's a reasonable target, I would say, but I see a lot more risk-sharing partnership and opportunities for OEMs. The OEMs, the supply chains, tier ones are looking eventually to further their R&D, their research work, and get programs to inject, you know, their competences and their work into new airframes. So I think we'll see a higher degree of supplier participation in this program was what I call the super primes, taking significant work packages.
I tend to agree, and I think both companies, both Airbus and Boeing, will have the wherewithal to launch their new narrow body products in the 2030 timeframe. And it's a market necessity. The A320 is now getting to be an older aircraft design, although the Neo is still very, very effective economically. But the next generation is needed, and that will come.
And again, you know, you're going to have critical technologies. Granted, all technologies or segment of the aircraft are critical, but you know, both the MAX and the Neo, of course, to a much lesser extent for the Neo, but you know, engine technology will be critical, and we've talked about that. But avionics technology in particular, you know, the architecture, the capabilities of these avionics systems are going to be in need of a significant, you know, rethinking, and there's some companies out there that are definitely at the forefront of that technology, whether it's Thales or Collins, of course. You know, materials technology are going to be a critical part of the performance and production of this narrow-body aircraft. Again, if we're thinking about making sure we paint aviation a little bit greener, even though aviation has been year over year cutting, you know, emissions by a significant percentage, but of course that doesn't please Greta in Sweden. The issue is that you know, materials technologies are going to be you know, significant in the ability to further reduce emissions. Engine technology is going to be significant in reducing emissions. Are we going to be able to get to a carbon neutral aircraft by 2035, as it has been announced by the French government? I don't believe so. I don't believe that by 2035, you're in a position to produce an aircraft. Can you produce a system, meaning the entire value chain, ranging from, you know, production, supply, suppliers, and aircraft, possibly. And I think this is the angle that we need to look at it. Not just the aircraft, but the entire ecosystem could become definitely carbon neutral by 2035.
Okay, we have time for two more questions. The first one will be, how do you see the A220 product going forward?
I see the A220 product line being expanded with one or two new models. I see a stretch of the A220 to an A220-500, bringing it to about 150 seats, which makes it about the same size as the A320. It's an upward move for those who have and operate the A220-100s and 300s. There's a possibility to take it up to the 700. And when Bombardier built the aircraft, they built the computer models for all of these stretches already. So the aircraft are essentially already designed and in the can, so to speak. But the question is, when do you need to launch them, because they have that capability, and the aircraft have already been designed on the computer, so they can implement those in reality relatively quickly. The question is, do you need to replace the A320, and do you compete and cannibalize your own market? If you get too large with it, do you compete with the A321, or is it a different range capability? And will Airbus introduce an A322 or a Super A321, or whatever we'd want to call that, as a new model to compete with whatever Boeing comes up with in the middle of the market? There are all sorts of scenarios that we can look at here in terms of product development, but much of that today would be speculation.
Yeah, I think speculation is the right word, Ernie. 220 is a great aircraft, turning out to be a very strong performer. Although I don't disagree with you on the 225, I would say the next 3 to 5 years are going to be about making sure that we are pushing the current orders of the 321 family, and that there is a definite stabilization of the production and revenues for that program. And the 225 will be very much depending on what Boeing decides to do. And again, you know, would it be in 5 years? Will it be in 10 years? it's a matter of speculation.
Okay, I think we're 2 minutes from the hard stop. I think we'll take no more questions. Ernie, if you want to do a wrap.
Well, thank you, and we appreciate your attendance today. How can AirInsight help you? We certainly have some strategies for risk mitigation and positioning for the recovery for the industry, and we can help you with market research, competitive intelligence, data models and analysis, and even culture and coaching. So if you can contact us for a no obligation discussion, our phone numbers are here, and you can look us up at airinsight.com as well. And Michelle, I'll let you put your commercial in for AIR.
Yeah, thank you. Well, AIR is the forecast and strategic advisory of the AirInsight Group. We have 3 products: market and forecast services, analyst research notes, and those are subscriptions you can get information on the AIR website. And we have also a strong strategic advisory practice that we'd love to talk to you about if there is any interest. Just contact us, call us. We're listening. Thank you.
And next week we're taking a 4th of July break, and thought that by putting something together over the 4th of July weekend would not get our normal quality by a Tuesday. So we've decided to take a break. We'll be back on the 14th, I believe, Addison.
Yes.
With another webinar. So we wish you a happy 4th of July break for those in the States, and a happy Canada Day tomorrow for those in Canada.
Well,
and thank you for being with us today. It's been great having you.
14th of July is not going to look good for the French, Ernie. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.